Great, and with that, we are moving on to our next session, which actually starts the actions in terms of the New Zealand context. It's this critical conversation about the future of apprenticeships in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Sorry about that again. So while we're having the stage reset, drawing on insights from ConCOVE's recent paper, Strengthening Support for Apprenticeships, Issues and Opportunities, we're going to have a panel to discuss how current policy settings are shaping the experiences of employers, apprentices, and the broader vocational ecosystem. So the session will be chaired by Sarah Badley, the partner at Martin Jenkins's, coming from a regulatory economics background at Treasury. She brings deep experience, including transport, energy and labour market and vocational education. And joining her on stage, we will have Roger Smythe, an expert in tertiary education performance and funding, and Erica Cumming, a champion of women in trades and a leader in strategy and governance. Please welcome 3 panellists on stage.
Right.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for ConCOVE for having this panel. So as introduced, I'm Sarah Badley, I'm a partner at Martin Jenkins, and oversaw the team that was involved in doing this work for ConCOVE, which was our privilege. I would also just like to acknowledge my colleague Natalie, who's in the room, who's one of the authors, Eamon Chen and Ben Craven, who are also the authors of the work. I don't know about you, but the last speaker, I leant over and whispered to Roger and I said, oh, just reminds me how much wealthier they are and the scale they have in Australia. And like many of you, I have become somewhat obsessed with the 46,000 net people we lost to Australia last year. And but our work was not about the depressing, it was about the way forward from insight to action. So what I'll do first is just share some insights from the work that we did for ConCOVE, and then discuss with my colleagues here, both Roger and Erica, about their view of our findings. Thanks. It's one of those reports sometimes you pull it together and you realise, well, these insights will not be world-changing for many of you in the room. But what we did through this work was really substantiate it with both international comparisons, some quantitative data, and also the deep qualitative insight interviews, which always tend to be the richer. And I'm sure that many of you in this room probably informed the research. So, headline number 1, demand is high but completion is low. Our completion rates, particularly even in comparison to Australia, who are a bit obsessed with their completion rates, we're lower than them again, and certainly lower than many of our international countries that we like to compare ourselves to. And so, our work really did highlight this, and it pulled out the fact that we are in a bit of a state of a completion crisis in New Zealand. And there are a number of factors that are behind that, including those related to the experience of the apprentices and learners, the state of the wider labour market, and the kind of complexity of the system and how people are able to navigate through it. There are large vacancies across trades, and even if we look through the current short-term, hopefully cyclical blip, we see the systemic kind of lack of skills in some of these workforce areas. And so this was really identified as something that is of a material challenge. A half a qualification is no qualification at all when it comes to an overall outcome, which is a long, successful, well-paid career where you can continue to grow and evolve and adapt. So this completion focus in our report was somewhat confronting. Financial barriers was the next key theme, and these financial barriers were largely explored through the experience of employers and the apprentices. And one of the kind of insights that we think is particularly useful is around the model of the way we think about apprenticeship policy settings. And we are still, as many of you know, still tied to that old stereotype of a 18-year-old male going into a trades path, and we know from the data that that is not the case. We have a very much demographic shift occurring in our apprenticeship pathways, and we have a gender, we have lots of excellent work happening. Erica, you might talk to us about that around gender mix, but our apprentices are older, and when they're older they have different life pressures, and those life pressures including family expectations and family formation, financial pressures are changing and shifting, and so our model, particularly the insights that will be shared soon around pastoral care, need to shift and adapt to that. So that was a very interesting and relevant kind of insight from our work. And that leads really to the third, which is just how important that pastoral care aspect is. And while we didn't really explore it in this work, other work we've done has gone into more dynamic labour marketing settings, including our kind of propensity from time to time to rely on migrant worker in particular sectors. Migrants are an incredibly important part of our labour market, but that we do have a bit of a cultural predisposition to providing pastoral care to workers of that type, but not workers who are coming through different pathways into work. And that's some work we've done outside of that. And so pastoral care and that relationship, that triangular relationship between learners, education providers, employers and workplaces, if that's not a really well-functioning dynamic with really clear roles and responsibilities and understanding of who's responsible for what and accountable for what, then the system can be a negative experience, particularly for the learners, but also for the employers. So that really came through in terms of our work. We saw some of the things that we just heard from the Australian context about careers advice and the quality of putting people onto different pathways. And we also saw some of the issues that are coming through about the size and scale of our sector and the high number of small to medium enterprises that mean that our employer capacity and capability is more limited than we might want. Which then turns from a capacity and capability perspective into training quality, which was inconsistent in terms of our findings. And so some people report extraordinarily positive experiences of their apprenticeship experience and their learning experience, and often that went to the quality of the employer relationship, but not always. Others reported a much less functioning relationship where they were unclear about who was supposed to be providing what, unclear of their own role and responsibility in that system. And so that kind of demoralising experience of education, while you're also facing the struggles of working and earning and likely slightly later in life, potentially career transitioning as well, can lead to a poorer set of outcomes. And this quote for me is one of those ones that really talks about the really important experience. This is just an anecdote that we picked from one of our qualitative insights. I think it kind of brings together many of the themes that we received across our qualitative and quantitative research here. And that experience is unsurprising because of finding number 5. Programs are fragmented and it's hard to coordinate. And, it is interesting listening to the Australian perspective who think, they do have a much more fragmented system than us. They're doing a lot of work on harmonisation. They're doing a lot of work on looking at their occupational regulation, which does affect a number of trades as well, to try and get a harmonised system. We have, for all those fundamentals, a harmonised system, but what we have is a proliferation of programs. And part of this is, the boundaries of the pilot to program, to targeting particular cohort groups, to starting things and not stopping things, starting things and hanging on to things, overlay that with a whole lot of structural change in the sector and you get a whole lot of fragmentation. And funnily enough, employers and apprentices told us they didn't know where to go. And so this fragmented support system makes its way through to funding, where we have fragmented funding. And I'm not always an advocate for scale funding. You know, centralise everything, we'll get it wrong. Decentralisation, we'll fragment it. You know, there's a balance to be struck here. But what we really need to do is have a clear strategy and vision for how to bring it all together and what we're trying to achieve as a coordinated system. So what does this mean? Well, Roger and Erica are going to discuss what all this means. But our takes were around that cleared shared vision, you know, more strategic focus, less on the structural movements in the sector and more on the vision and the systems and the forward momentum and the aspiration, so that we can actually coordinate to something rather than being structured to it. Better support more capable and more accountable employers. Better direct funding toward apprentices, recognising that they experience the funding that's available to other learning in a different way than people who might be going through the tertiary system, for example, and to really put value on the importance, the criticality of these workers and the eventual contribution they'll make to our sector productivity and our growth and productivity overall. So, Roger, what do you make of it all?
Right, well, one of the great things that ConCOVE does is it's commissioned a whole range of very similar reports, but always with a slightly different perspective. So my take on the Martin Jenkins work is I see in the context of a couple of other pieces of work. One, the work done by Alan and Clark on the quality of training advice, and the other is the recent work done by Brendan Maszewski and myself on the way that vet funding system works. And really, if you look at those three reports together, there are really three common areas that need attention, and one of them is to do with the pipeline, the way of navigating through to training or to sustainable employment. The second, the support that's offered to workplace learners while they're in their training. And third is the role of employers. So if we just look at those in turn, the first one, I think the navigation, Sarah used the word about the proliferation of the complexity of it. One of the things is that there are myriad pathways which help people from school through to training and to sustainable employment. And the challenge is how do individuals create a coherent pathway through that morass of and that the roots, the myriad of routes through the qualification system. So each of those programs has its own outcome goal. For instance, the accumulation of credits or getting off unemployment. They're all created by different agencies and all with a different focus. And so what happens is that when somebody achieves one of those goals, the agency can wipe its hands and say, job well done. But they might well have been simply helping a person onto a pathway to precarious employment. If we look at Youth Guarantee is one of the biggest of those programs. It's focused on credits, but what the analysis shows is that the people who are the graduates of that program perform worse in the labour market than those with similar backgrounds, similar characteristics, who didn't do the program. What the research internationally shows is that what programs that are successful in that area have in common is the presence of a mentor, of a navigator, of a guide, somebody who can offer individualised advice. And that's why in our work, Brendan and I proposed that there should be priority given to establishing some kind of network of navigators or mentors for young people at risk. The second area, the support for work-based learners, well, if we're going to improve the completion rates, the kind of thing Sarah was talking about, trainees need decent support, technical support, pastoral support. They need culturally appropriate support. They need to learn how to learn independently. A lot of work-based learning has the characteristics of self-directed learning. That requires motivation, and motivation often needs support. when we were doing our study, I heard cases of excellent work done by training advisors, but also cases where the training advice was rushed, intermittent, not culturally appropriate, not well directed to the specific needs of the learner. And as for the other part of the advice and support given to learners on the job, of course, is the employer's role. And many employers don't have the skills to properly use their role or properly fulfill their role as an on-site mentor. You know, we all know here that integrating work with learning is the most effective way of delivering training, but that's when it works best. When the advisor and the employer are both, if you like, performing deliberate acts of training, and that's culturally appropriate, and where there is decent support in place. This is an area where we have cut corners too long. This is too important to cut corners. We need to power up that system. And the third, the role of the employer as teacher. The whole thing with work-based learning is that the primary instructor is the employer. The employer is in effect a teacher. We don't let people teach in schools or early childhood unless they are properly trained to do it. And in some European countries, the part of the acquisition of the full qualification in the vocational system is to train how to train. And we need to recognise in our system, one, that there is a cost to employers, a financial cost to employers of having an apprentice, and that's particularly the case, difficult for smaller employers. And secondly, that the employer's role, we've got to recognise the critical importance of the employer's role as trainer and train the employer for that. So
thanks, Roger. Now I have to declare, partly when Anne-Marie and Catherine asked us to undertake this work, they knew that we would, they wanted something from a policy perspective, something that would hopefully influence policy settings. And I just have to be really honest with you that as a recovering Treasury official, when Roger says we need another navigator, it makes me go back to my first principles hard wiring, which is if we need another navigator, we need a new system.
Yeah.
So Erica, what do you think the experience of employers and you've got a lot of insight from your work. What do you think they would say to that challenge that Roger's just put out?
Yeah, and look, it's interesting, isn't it? The risk of saying, for some people yesterday we talked about it's great to come in the room and we see all these people that we've known for a long time, and I risk sitting here as someone almost 46 years ago started an apprenticeship. So, maybe I'm too old to be sitting here. But I think, there's also a risk that we think the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I think we're at that time, aren't we, where, I'm just reflecting on being in the room, that we're in a stage where a number of organisations are in our disestablishment phase, and another group is sitting here going, we're going to be moving from a work-based learning subsidiary maybe to a PTE, I don't think we've got many people from the Tertiary Education Commission or MOE or NZQA in the room. Might have that wrong, but not sure. So we've got quite a lot of a challenge, and I don't know how many employers we have in the room because they're probably just at work trying to make a buck. And so I guess when we think about that, we're asking employers to kind of, I think one of your second comments where we need to get employers to be more accountable. And we could say that, but they're kind of starting by running a business. And we have to consider, that we're asking, if we're really lucky, an employer will employ some people, or, a business will employ some people. And then if those people are lucky, they might happen to get an apprenticeship, that someone's committed to that. If the employer's not burnt already by going, have I actually got 4 years to commit to someone? Is my business still going to be going in that period of time? And, I think over many years we kind of rolled into apprenticeships, but, business has changed a wee bit for people. And we've got a lot of people that are on the job. So we might have an employer who may or may not be the trainer, might not be the best trainer. And you're right, in terms of, are they the best people to do the training? Maybe not. You know, we heard for those again yesterday in Ngāti Toa were talking about their training that they're looking at putting in place. And their first thing they were thinking about doing was training trainers before they started bringing any people in and starting a system. So I think there is an opportunity for that, but it's jolly hard to, you know, to ask your employer to kind of go, put that first before you think about, you know, opening the door or getting in your truck. You know, what are you going to do with those people with you? So I think we've got some real challenges ahead. You know, they've been there for a long time, but we've also got that thing around a number of businesses are taking on contractors. You know, they don't necessarily have a pile of staff with them, they have a group of contractors. And actually, does that contractor who's working in that business or with that business, do they want the responsibility of training someone? Because they've actually got dollars that are counting over as well. So we're kind of in a different employment status for a lot, you know, for some people. So who's actually taking that responsibility? Maybe it's meant to just be the learner, and we've got ageing learners, you know, our average age of people that are starting are around 26. You know, they're not coming in necessarily as the 16-year-old that needs support in a different way. But equally, we're asking for our training providers, you know, potentially to provide support into that, you know, your tripartite arrangement, you know, and do those people have necessarily the skills? You know, one of the systems that we thought we could have had, maybe, with some of the changes ahead, could have been around saying, do we look at the country as a national, you know, look where we've got more Māori learners in particular areas. Could the iwi, you know, could that particular iwi be providing some of that pastoral care, for example, and not expecting someone to kind of be a master of many? Lots of opportunities, but gosh, you know.
The point you're making around the degree to which the appetite from employers to take on an apprentice and to invest the time and education, and then when you have a completion rate like ours, you know, that dynamic where you've got an employer who might actually maybe get to that point of business confidence when they're willing to do it. Labour market might be tight, so you know, they know that they're going to need to invest to get the labour that they need. But they also, I mean, they don't know, but they will in their anecdote and experience that the odds are not great that they'll finish and that they'll actually be able to fully complete. And so when we, in our work, make the point around accountability can only really come from clarity. You know, whose job is it? When does my job begin and your job end? And these are people with, you know, experiences and pressures. So I'm interested, Roger, in your view around, and I do want to acknowledge just the structural change and the massive energy that is taken out of many of you in the room who would have been, you know, who've made your life course helping vocational education and apprentices succeed. So I do want to acknowledge that. But Roger, what are your views as someone who's been alongside this policy area? If you think about it from a policy perspective and you hear this issue about role clarity and, you know, people have got there's not much bandwidth from an employer perspective, what are your observations?
Well, I mean, you made the point earlier about the fact that when I was talking about navigation, you kind of implied that you saw that as kind of a band-aid rather than addressing the system. I mean, you're right. I think what we need to do actually is to stand back, despite all the change, and address the design of the system in a more systematic way. One of the problems that we've got, I think, is that parts of the way the system works are being done, if you like, on the cheap. We're not looking systematically at the training in a way that leads to, if you like, a kind of an intergenerational accumulation of knowledge and skill over the course of a lifetime. In other words, you know, if we're going to see if we're going to expect more of employers and make employers more accountable for their training function, we can't just slap more responsibilities on them without looking at how we prepare people for that role, so that the architecture of the system needs to provide some of those missing elements, which include things like the way we train people so that when they become qualified, part of their responsibility is acknowledged, recognised and trained for, is their role as a trainer, as a teacher. And I think in relation to the question of the shifting demographics of the training cohort, I think that's part of the responsibility of the employer is to have the skills that recognises that, but that's also an issue for the way the funding system works, the way the qualifications are designed, and the way that people's prior learning is recognised, things like that. So there's a whole lot of. We've been so busy with structural change since 2018-19 that I think that there's a whole lot of issues that have just simply not been recognised or addressed or dealt to. Some of the points that Erica was raising.
Yeah. It is interesting, just again reflecting on the Australian perspective. I'm obsessed with the Australian Productivity Commission reports that are being released at the moment, and their one on labour market. If you haven't read it, it's a cracking good read. They are considering, well, they're recommending, it's got a long way to go, mechanisms like tax credits for employers who undertake vocational education. So those kind of bold initiatives that really would incentivise investment from an employer's perspective of both the money and time. We've got some questions and we've got not much time. So I think just looking at those questions, the one around why people don't complete, look, it's a complicated. Read the report. We've got a number of different reasons that are identified from our research. One of the main ones was around kind of funding and financial pressures, and I think that experience of the apprentice and the learner really came through. That inconsistency of their employment experience and their training experience was another. So that's available on the ConCOVE website if you'd like to delve into that in more detail.
Can I just add to that, Sarah? I think the thing too that we think about apprenticeships, someone not completing their apprenticeship, we kind of sometimes forget that these people are actually in employment. So as you're kind of reiterating that more, it's the employment ceases sometimes. Yeah. And that we actually haven't necessarily got that tracking of those people. We think about, we heard before sort of in the Australian market, and thinking about, there were some discussions yesterday about funding following the learner, and if there was a better system then of actually where are these people going, because sometimes they've kind of fallen out of employment, either things went badly, for various different reasons, that they could have perhaps picked up and carried on, or might have been interested in doing that. I mean, I have a stepson who I think after 8 years finally finished his building apprenticeship, mostly because someone from BCITO took him in the hand and said, come on, your life's been a bit crap, but we're going to get you there. So, sometimes we just need those, be able to follow those people a bit more. We mightn't have that same phenomena, and obviously in particular sectors where you've got that boom and bust cycle, you've got all of those normal employment relationship breakdowns as
or disruptions. Overlaid that with this sort of cyclical boom and bust. In terms of the other questions we've got here, there's the point here about the learner voice and what kind of learning modes they want. And we heard, our research did have a large qualitative element to it, and that wasn't a major theme that came through. There were, and it's more other themes that were higher. Their experience of things like the quality of the employment relationship and the quality of their learning experience and they turned up on site and no one knew what they were there for, and those kind of things came through, but not the modalities of learning. Have you got any reflections on that point, Erica, and that question that's been asked of us?
Yeah, I guess it's like I've got myself a bit lost, so I've got a bit lost on that. Just
how young
Yeah.
people, well, actually not young people.
They're not
Look at
young
that
people.
with my own
I think
biases.
that's, I think
how
that's
they
the
learn.
point, that they're not just young people.
Exactly.
You know, we've got it is about how they're kind of picking up and how things are, you know, fitting for their, you know, fit for purpose. You know, every single learner, you know, the cohort of one, you know, that we think about for apprenticeship training is one of those challenges. And so, but you know, when you've got, you know, people on site that are really, that they can be quite out of contact with, you know, that learner and their various environments. And it's like how you're bringing those together can create some of those real challenges for people.
Yeah, and the excitement that AI will bring in terms of, you know, navigation. The days of get a good website and everyone will know what their role and responsibility is as well. So the power of AI to really transform people's learning and navigational experiences is really interesting.
And thinking about the age of which people are, you know, we heard before, they said, you know, in 5 years' time, programs will have to have AI, blah, 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 and it's like, that's too late. How many of our employers are kind of sitting at home at 2 a.m. in the morning going, oh, I need to learn that as well so I can make sure I'm up to speed with things? I mean, you know, crikey.
Okay, now I am very mindful we've got outstanding questions, but we're all also out of time. I can say that the report is on the ConCOVE website. Natalie and I will be around throughout the remainder of the day, so feel free to come and pick our brains, and obviously pick the brains of Erica and Roger as well, who bring a depth of experience to the issues. So thank you to both of you, and thank you everyone.
That's right.
Loving the spark.